This is NHTV2, North Haven Government Television, a service of North Haven Community Television. The following program is brought to you through the support of the Town of North Haven.
I'd like to call the Board of Fire Commission meeting for Tuesday, April 16, 2024 to order. I'd like everyone to please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'd like to ask for the approval of the minutes of the Board of Fire Commission meeting, regular meeting, held on March 19, 2024. Do I hear a second to the motion?
Second.
Any question on the motion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So moved. Chief's report.
Good evening, all. We'll cover a Chief's report, and it's going to cover a time period of March 19th of last month till yesterday, April 15th, tax day. So since our last meeting, the fire department has provided ALS interceptor transport on 13 different occasions, 19 incident responses to the highway, 97 incidents in which just an ambulance responded, and there was no reason for fire asset to respond. Total number of calls were 355, 116 of which were overlapping, which covers about 33% of the time there being multiple incidents occurring. That covers the alarms. Regarding the budget, last year this time we were at 77.5%. As we sit here this evening, we're at 79.1%. The fire fees through period 9 is just under $350,000. Our ALS billing is just over $76,000. A couple of pressing items that continue to impact the budget. One of which is the ongoing lease of an apparatus at $3,000 a month, which was not budgeted for. And so just keep that in mind, please. Also, there was just over $12,000 expense in the vehicle maintenance repair line this last month that we had to apply the expense somewhere, but we will get reimbursed by the state of Connecticut. And that is for the proper disposal of some of the real bad foam that you've been hearing about on the news. So that's a state exchange program that was set up. We have to initially incur the cost, but we'll be reimbursed very shortly within this fiscal year.
So, can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the foam containing PFAS has been outlawed essentially, and there's an alternative foam available on the market. It's twice the cost, I might add, compared to what the old foam was. But if we had any of the old foam that still existed in containers or an apparatus, particularly an apparatus, it needed to get flushed out, and there's only certain companies in the state that are authorized to do that. So the foam needed to be disposed of, and the tanks need to be flushed out in order to make them clean, if you will, and safe. So now if any foam is used anywhere in town, which we do use from time to time, and there were any tests done to be sure that there is no PFAS in the foam, we will come back completely clean. This has been known to many fire departments throughout the state for about the last year. Unfortunately, there are still some accidental discharges from time to time of foam containing PFAS. And if that is the case, the municipality would be on the hook for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so it's to our benefit that we just disposed of it. Some staffing shortages that are impacting us. We've had one member on long-term sick leave this entire calendar year. We don't expect that individual to return for about another 2 months. Another member on injury leave since February 23rd. We had one member out for a period of about 30 days on sick leave, and keep in mind that we are still only running with one of 2 shifts right now with 11. So 2 shifts have the capacity for it. Only 1 shift has had 11. We expect a firefighter to graduate from the academy in about 2 months' time, and we'll be able to bring that a second shift up to 11 firefighters. That covers the budget. The Fire Marshal's Office, you were all provided a report on that. Let me just pull that up quickly. So particularly on the second page of your report for inspections, 50 inspections last month, 4 different violations were corrected from the month before. 49 permits and only one plan review last month, which is unusual. But again, this was March, so it's not too much into the spring yet. This particular month, I know there's been a lot of plans that are in the works right now because of the time of year that we're in. Other than that, nothing too different from the norm on your fire marshal's report. I have nothing further to report there. And that concludes my report.
Any questions of the chief regarding his report?
Just one quick question, when you were talking about staffing, and that we have one shift at 11, I know it all in terms of people being out and the coverage of that one person. Do you have any sense of how frequently that landed on, the shift where we had 11? You know what I'm
For
asking?
the one shift with 11?
Yeah,
Yeah, so I provided that to the commission in an email a couple months back, or a couple weeks back maybe.
okay.
That showed the savings there, yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the savings, I'm just mean, you mentioned several long-term, people that have been out. Has that happened to have landed on that shift of 11?
So the report that I sent you covered specifically if there were absences on the calendar days that 11 was assigned. It didn't get into if it was in one of these cases or not. It probably was.
Okay,
I just don't know offhand.
okay.
Any other questions of the chief? Hearing none, we'll move on to correspondence. Chief, did you receive any correspondence?
Other than the day-to-day correspondence, I have nothing to report.
Have any commissioners received any correspondence? Old business of the fire department.
Old business, I just want to make sure the commission was aware of the two engines we've been waiting on for a couple of years now. We expect to arrive hopefully by the time that we meet next in May.
Exciting.
Could be.
Yeah.
We'll see. I'm starting to believe it now.
Really? So, Chief, the expectation is once the engines arrive, it's gonna be 2-3 weeks before they get into operation?
Yeah, at that point, we'll be able to relinquish the lease that we've been taking on as well.
Good. New business of the fire department.
New business, I have nothing listed for the commission.
Good of the fire department.
I got a few things. So we had our fallen firefighter memorial ceremony on April 7th. Thank you to all those that attended. It seemed like it was very well embraced by the families and by the department. All good positive feedback from it, other than it being a little bit cold and a little bit loud due to some traffic noise. So we tried doing it a little bit differently, having it outdoors versus inside. Just trying to differentiate our promotional ceremonies from that. Next year we'll make a couple of modifications, but the anticipation is moving forward that we'll do this on an annual basis. Other than that, I do have the one firefighter that I had mentioned prior that will be graduating on May 22nd, 2024. I am personally unable to attend. This will be the first graduation. I'm not able to attend in person, but any commission that would like to attend is welcome to do so. And I have a couple other things regarding operations to bring the commission up to speed on. So as discussed during a couple of different meetings here and during the budget workshop, we're going to modify a couple of items. One is traditionally when a career engine is called out of town to respond for mutual aid, we've always put the volunteers on standby, and that's kind of just to ready a response, assemble a response because of that time, that inherent time that there's a delay in them responding to the station and then subsequently to a call. So to eliminate that, we've always put them on standby so they respond to the station, and at that point they're responding from the station to the incident, cutting down response time. It does something else for us too. It also allows us to identify if there's volunteers available at that moment in time, so that if there's not, we can begin to make some changes. Unfortunately, the volunteers being the numbers that they're at, they've asked that be something that they can be refrained from being dispatched to. It also ends up being several hours at times that they're on standby for. And so we are going to make an operational change where we'll cover our station, and we'll do so without putting the volunteers on standby. But if we respond to the scene of an area of town, we're going to call back career personnel and incur overtime. That's a direct request of the volunteers who are starting to say, hey, this is getting to be a lot. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second being, we are considering, unfortunately, deviating from national standards, which requires multiple engines to respond to commercial fire alarms because of the hazards that are present at commercial buildings. Again, that is drawing upon our existing resources of volunteers. And so we're looking at restructuring the commercial fire alarm response to start to take some of the volunteer responses off of those. Because again, the call numbers are exceeding what they're available to respond to. That may mean that we have to assign more career personnel to the scene, to the incident, because I still need a certain number of people to get the job done when we're there. And so just a couple of things to keep the commission aware of. Nothing's been changed yet. By the time we meet again, those changes might be effective.
Okay. Any update on, I mean, the numbers that, we've talked about the volunteers and after the budget hearing, or the budget meeting that we had, and what the Board of Finance has essentially not approved any of the, personnel that was requested. Any thoughts on, I know we were at 5 volunteers at Northeast, but one was getting ready to retire, correct?
Yeah, so you attended the meeting,
Yep.
I remember, that we had when we updated the volunteers, and this is before the Board of Finance had released the preliminary budget. You heard the state of mind of the volunteers. At this point, I'm gonna keep the change it looks like to just this and try to see what this does, because combining the volunteer companies is gonna be detrimental to their membership.
Okay.
It's gonna triple the call volume for one particular company and make it that much harder to maintain 25% of incidents.
Okay.
And Chief, when we call back full-time paid staff, how successful are we to bring those folks back to the station when there's a call?
Understand that it takes about an hour
Yeah.
to accomplish. Contractually, you have an hour, and just if you just think about what needs to take place, you need to get a hold of an officer. Officer needs to start coming to work. Officer needs to come to work, start figuring out who to call, what apparatus you have available, because every day, every shift, it could be different. So I don't want to call in more personnel, and we even have apparatus available to staff at that point. So the officer needs to come in, assess the situation, and figure out what needs to happen, and then start calling firefighters. And it takes about an hour. We're not always successful, but most of the time we are at this point. It doesn't happen an incredible lot right now either.
So, I just want to make sure the 2 changes, the one not being on standby when you're called for mutual aid, and then the other incident being commercial, but if there's a house fire, the
Sure,
volunteers
that's
would
not
still be
changed.
called in. Okay.
Just a sign of the times with the continued reduction of our volunteers and the willingness of them to be able to respond, or ability to respond. I know that they'd like to, but unfortunately they can't. That just reinforces what our comments were at the town meeting, and the fact that without the volunteers, we have to certainly depend upon our paid staff in order to be assured that we'll have persons turn out for those emergencies, whether it be, fire, medical emergencies, or, any commercial type of scenario. I'm hopeful that the Board of Finance members and our first selectman and the residents who were in attendance, heard our message, and also heard the number of other residents who stepped up to the microphone in support of public safety. There weren't certainly a lot of residents there at the meeting, which was unfortunate, but the folks that did step up to speak, whether or not it was specifically about public safety in the fire department, or it was about the Board of Education and they incorporated the fire department in their comments, I was pleased about their positive response. I know that there was one particular resident that made a recommendation or a suggestion that potentially we the town include 2 additional firefighters in this year's budget. As you're aware, or might be aware, we had no firefighters that were budgeted for last year, and none are proposed for this year. The 2 firefighters that was proposed by one of the residents would not help us to have an additional apparatus 25% of the time.
Right.
Of which was the purpose of the chief's request, to have 4 firefighters, so that we would be able to have 4 firefighters in 1 apparatus at the Washington Avenue station. So currently, the only stations that have full-time firefighters are certainly on Broadway, our fire headquarters, and this station here at Montaguese. The other 2 stations have no firefighters on duty on Washington Avenue or on Ridge Road. So those are strictly volunteer stations with no personnel in those stations, unless volunteers come to the station to assist. So just would like the residents who are on North Haven Public TV to have a clear understanding as to where the full-time firefighters come from, and the fact that those 2 firehouses are volunteer stations, and with only less than 20 volunteers, none of them are stationed at the volunteer stations.
The interesting thing when you had that meeting with the volunteers was to listen to the difference in the perspectives of the volunteers based on sort of generational differences, which, you know, many of the younger volunteers, or, you know, people in their 20s and 30s, talked about how life was busy, and they were committed to being a volunteer, but it was different from a time where volunteer firefighters came down to the firehouse and would hang out together at the firehouse. So that doesn't really happen anymore, just because of the way life is now. So, I mean, I think that's part of the, you know, that may be some of what it makes it difficult to get volunteers. It just, people can't leave work like they used to be able to. They're not working for small companies that'll let them go during the day. So, you know, I think that just sort of also, it was just interesting to listen to their perspectives, because definitely you could hear a difference on the concerns based on, you know, some generational differences.
Sure. And I think the time restraints as it pertains to training, volunteers have to train just like full-time firefighters have to train. They need to be in physical condition because it's a very strenuous job. They need to know their job, so that the training is imperative for them to know what their role and responsibilities are in order for them to be safe on the fire ground, and certainly to assist their brother and sister firefighters. And then to meet the requirement of is it 30% of the calls or 35?
25.
25%. 25% of the calls is taxing, as Jen indicated. Whether it's a generational thing or just that they're working and the call comes in at 3 o'clock in the morning and they have to get up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock to go to work, to put food on the table and support the family. They're going to go to work. So even though we've made many efforts to encourage persons to volunteer with tax abatements that were equal to whatever the maximum is that the state allows, and we have had discussions here at this commission about paying per call. Many different initiatives have been taken by the State Chiefs Association and surrounding municipalities, with not a lot of success in bringing volunteers to the table. So as I mentioned at the town meeting, in the past, volunteers have saved the town of North Haven millions of dollars of work hours in volunteering their time and providing quality service to our residents. Unfortunately, the times have changed. And I use the TJ Maxx slogan all the time, the max for the minimum. You cannot get the most amount of services for the least amount of money. And as it pertains to running a municipality in tough economic times, it costs the municipality lots of money to do business. And it certainly costs monies to have sufficient staff to run a fire department and to meet all of the national and state standards that we need to adhere to. So we're going to do the best that we possibly can with the monies that are going to be allocated to the fire department. But again, as I indicated at the meeting, we could only do what we can do. And if that would potentially mean that we would need to stack calls so that if calls come in and we have no personnel to send out and Nelson Ambulance is not available, persons will have to wait for the next available apparatus to be relieved from duty from the previous call in order to respond to the next call. That's certainly not something that the chief or our firefighters wish to do. They are sworn to protect lives and property. And we, as elected fire commissioners, have a fiduciary responsibility to try and maximize what our department is able to do and deliver quality customer services to the residents, business owners, and visitors of our town. And we can only do that with the personnel and apparatus that we have available. So I think we have clearly articulated our need, not wants, they're needs, and the residents will need to determine at the next Board of Finance as to what their wishes are. They could come to that meeting and voice their interest in restoring the 4 firefighters to our budget, and that will obviously add to whatever the mill rate increase will be, or they can make some adjustments somewhere else. I don't know, whatever the Board of Finance will do. But if the residents wish to do that, it will be for their benefit. And if they don't, we've already indicated we're going to do the best we possibly can do with the finances that the Board of Finance allocates to this department. Any other thoughts?
No.
Chief? Hearing none, I'll ask for public comments.
Yes.
Ms. Barrett?
Hi, everyone. I'm Nancy Barrett, 1 Crestview Drive. I'm a member of the Board of Finance, but I'm just here this evening as a regular citizen. So I have a couple of questions, most of them for the chief, and then I'd like to share something with this commission. So Chief, in the last 2 budget workshops, I noticed that you eliminated one piece of information, and I wondered if you just happen to know it off the top of your head. If you don't, if you could share it later. Just the number of structure fires in 2022 and 2023. In previous years, you've reported that, and it's somewhere between 12 and 20 per year. But if that changed significantly, I think that's an important issue.
Probably hasn't changed significantly. I don't have the exact number, but it's pretty close to that.
Okay. And then, does the calculation of overlapping calls include those answered by Nelson Ambulance?
No.
So it's only the calls responded to by the fire department?
Correct.
Okay, that's helpful. And then, have you noticed a change in the last year or so to the average response time for the career firefighters? Meaning first on scene.
There won't be a significant change in the last year. For the 4 years prior, there was, because we were bringing on the company at Montelise full-time, and so 1 shift at a time. Obviously, we look over the course of a time, you can see that number increase. But that number won't change all that much at this point in time in the last year, because there hasn't been any new career staff added.
So hopefully with bringing on people at Mondelez, the average response time would go down.
It did, but up until, we haven't added anybody now in over a year. And so your question was for the last year, so for the last year, it won't be much.
It's been steady, it hasn't gone up, in other words. Okay. And then, the steep grant for about, $428,000 or so with town matching of about $107,000. Is that gonna create 4 additional bays at Northeast for a total of 6?
It will,
So 6 bays.
that's correct.
Okay, all right, I'm just checking. What is the current status of the Northeast Firehouse? Is it operational as a volunteer firehouse?
It's operational, the volunteer firehouse. The second floor, if you recall from the workshop, has not been completed since it was remodeled 10 years ago.
So obviously nobody stays there, right?
Nobody
They're
can stay there.
volunteers.
Right.
Is they're
Well,
volunteers,
they were
but-
gonna, but one of the things we talked about tonight was standby. So when they get placed on standby in the middle of the night, we haven't been able to accommodate them in any way.
I see. So standby meaning physically at the station. So, but there are volunteers that are assigned to Northeast.
There are 5 or 6 left there right now, yeah.
Okay, but, and they are assigned to an apparatus there, 'cause I think I remember seeing some that are outside, because obviously you're starting construction, correct? Or renovations. I
No,
should
the-
say.
For this, regarding the steep grant,
Well, just, I noticed that there were vehicles parked outside, so I assumed that they were parked outside because they,
you might have just caught it at a day when they were in the back training. That's all. That's
okay,
where all our training takes place. So if you see a lot of apparatus outside, sometimes they're in the back area just training.
and the idea is to have these 6 bays to keep vehicles indefinitely, even though there's a decreased number of volunteers, correct?
So if you think back, and I don't think you were on the Board of Finance at that time, but when the stations were all created, conceptually, Mondelez, West Ridge, Northeast, were all supposed to have a third bay on them, so that we can grow into the future. Because when you build firehouses, you're supposed to build them 50 years into the future. The third bay on all 3 firehouses was cut. So we don't have any more apparatus bays on our 3 outlying stations at present day than we did 25, 30 years ago. So this 4 bays is designed to do a couple of things. It's allowed to build us into the future, to be able to store a training apparatus, so that we're not taking apparatus that are in service, because if you look at all of our apparatus right now, they're all in service apparatus, because they have to be. So this particular bay is going to is going to allow training apparatus to be positioned there, because the training grounds is right there on that, across the street essentially. And so that way here we can use training apparatus without having to use in-service apparatus and delay response times. We don't have the ability for that right now. Your CERT team, right, Community Emergency Response Team, that has about 70 different volunteers, has a CERT bus and a van and so forth, equipment that currently has very limited space for shelter, so it's going to be placed there as well. We've talked oftentimes, this commission has talked about having a mechanic to be able to service our equipment. I have no place to put a mechanic right now. And so having a bay situated so that we could grow into a mechanic position someday, this would be a great opportunity. And then like I said, you've asked already before, I think, what was I gonna do with those bays? And I told you I don't have a plan because I don't wanna have a plan. I wanna be able to grow into that space.
But the original plan, when all of these renovations were done to these 3 different volunteer firehouses, was that the number of volunteers was going to grow. And
No.
obviously it's declined by 70%.
I don't think the expectation was ever for the number of volunteers to grow. I was
Or
not
at
chief.
least maintained, right?
No, I was not chief at that time, but the trend then, as the trend is now, is that the volunteers continue to decline. But if you look at this particular station, it was built to accommodate career staff someday. So that wasn't the case. Those other 2 stations, we ran out of money, is what happened. And so that's why there was nothing done on the second floor Northeast. However, it's been like that now for the last 10 years.
But this house was obviously originally a volunteer house, and when it was renovated, it was a volunteer house, correct? It was the historic Mondelez Firehouse,
Sure.
right? So, but you're saying it was renovated in order to eventually transition to becoming a career firehouse?
Yes, 100% it was.
I see, okay, this, I didn't get that impression when the bond package went out, but I thought it was really to do something fantastic for all of the volunteers in our town at that time.
It was going to serve that purpose until the time was that we needed career staff.
So back 11 years ago, almost at this point, when Chief Landisio was the chief, this particular fire station was leveled. The old station was leveled, and you have here male and female bunk rooms and a captain's office, which was not part of what the original volunteer station was all about. That this was all in preparation for the future to have this particular station become a full-time station with full-time staff. That was discussed back 11 years ago. Now, it was supported by volunteers when the station opened, but quickly we saw the decline of the volunteers and the need to bring full-time firefighters here, and that's when the town started to offer 2 full-time firefighters per year until we had sufficient firefighters in order to man this station. So, but this station was built specifically to one day become a full-time fire station.
So that change took place in 2011, and you started bringing in career firefighters in, was it 2017 or 18, something like that?
I'm not quite sure when the full-time staff came in, about that time.
Right, so
Yeah.
6 or 7 years later.
Yes.
Got it, okay. And then, in the current fiscal year budget, you had a capital item for a Stryker Life Pack 15. I just want to make sure that you actually have been in receipt of this.
We do.
And is it assigned?
It is, yeah.
Sure. Okay, so I fully supported that. I know it's a critical piece of equipment. I know it's
Sure.
$50,000 for just one, right?
Yes.
So, but people's lives depend upon it, so I know that that's something that's really important, but I've been following, okay, well, there's a deposit that has been put down, and now it seems like the full amount has been paid, so I just want to make sure that it has actually been delivered. Terrific, and so it's assigned to one of the engines, or?
It can go to an engine. I don't know where to actually assign right now. Off the top of
And
my
you,
head,
and you have a couple of, I
We
assume,
do.
combination AEDs and EKG
Yep.
leads.
we do.
So a combination,
Yeah.
okay, terrific. And then you mentioned the, the budget, which, of course, we're 9 months into the fiscal year as of the end of March, and so 9 out of 12 would be 75%. So ideally, you want your various expenditure line items to be, tracking about 75%, and as the chief mentioned, you're currently at about 79%, 79.1. So I just looked at a couple of different things that kind of jumped out on the page at me. We mentioned the contractual replacement staffing, and it looks like you only have about a month left in what's left in the balance of that line item. And any expectations based upon somebody coming out of the academy and so forth that you might actually be able to come in closer to budget with that particular line item or no?
Most likely not.
No. And then the EMT line, is that tied to salaries? I know it's a flat payment, but is it tied to the CBA or is that?
It's tied directly to the CBA.
It is, okay. And your EMT training is at about 146%.
Mhm.
So it's,
Yep, so we sent
is it paramedic billing or the paramedic training or?
paramedic training.
Got it, okay. I didn't think that was gonna start until next year, that's why I was surprised by that.
Yeah, we took advantage of 2 people who we didn't pay for to go to fire school
Okay.
and instead shifted the tuition cost to EMT school.
Okay. And then you mentioned the vehicle maintenance repair, there's also a big lift in technology, it's at about 96%.
Yeah, but that's pretty much spec at this point. Not all these lines are gonna trend with the 3/4 of the way to the budget.
No, of course not, no, I just wondered if
Yeah.
I see a real outlier, I would wanna ask about that. And then, okay, so that leads me to what I wanted to share with you all. And I have something to hand out, but let me just tee this up, there's a couple of different points I'd like to make. So, at the January 13th to 2024 fire budget workshop, Chief and then Mr. Mazzillo and Ms. Caldwell were there. Chief, you began your presentation saying that the total 911 call volume was flat from 2022 to 2023. But then there's articles in the newspaper talking about falling short of safety standards, in which you refer to a rising number of emergency calls. So that seems to me a little inconsistent. So is it flat or is it rising?
Sure, so I think if we look back at the trend, year to year, it was essentially flat, but if you trend that over the last 5 years, 10 years, it's consistently gone up.
I see. Okay, so you're not just talking about the recent history,
Correct.
because that's kind of the impression that I got from this, is that it's kind of the recent history. But
Correct.
I actually went back and I looked at your budget workshop from last year, the January of 2023, and compared it to the numbers that you shared this year. And it turns out that the annual call volume from 2022 to 2023 actually decreased by 6%. And at that same time, the number of medical or EMS calls responded to exclusively by Nelson, with no supplemental response from the fire department for your new policy. During that same period, it increased by 13%. So if you combine these two facts, it results in a net 11% decreased demand on the North Haven Fire Department. Would you agree with that?
I don't see your numbers, but I can
Okay.
understand it.
All right, well,
Sure.
let me share the notes with you, if you don't mind handing these around, it's just a single page. So it's that first box is what I'm talking about, in which I take the total number of calls, this is for 22 and 2023. I show that there's a 6% increase, I subtract off the Nelson Ambulance 911 responses, and as I mentioned, those jumped up by 13%. And that leaves you with that bottom line, net number of calls.
So Nancy, can I stop you for a minute, because I have to ask you a question. So when the chief is now giving us numbers, I believe the numbers, when he's giving us the number of calls that are just handled by Nelson, you are gonna, because there are more now that are being handled by Nelson than there were last year.
Yes, that's what I just said, right.
My
So the
question
total
is,
number of calls went down, the number of calls from Nelson went up. The net impact of the two
well,
things.
so my question is, when you give us our numbers, you have said before that because Nelson is handling certain calls, they're not necessarily in your numbers
They're
anymore.
not in the numbers.
So that's, I think, maybe where you're, that's where I'm gonna question your math, and I need to kind of take a look at this to really see if it's
Okay,
accurate or
well,
not, so.
I thought that I had asked very clearly, when you present the total number of calls, does that include Nelson or not? And I thought the answer was yes. But then when you give the breakdown into the three different categories of EMS, motor vehicle, and fire related, that does not include.
Neither one includes Nelson.
Neither one includes Nelson,
Neither one.
that's why that whole thing about the percentages was, that discussion about the percentages is because the call volume does not include Nelson, because Nelson, the ones that are just handled by Nelson are it's not pulling from fire department resources.
Okay.
So, and that's the numbers he's giving us, is what is pulling from fire department resources.
Mhm.
So, so I just want to make sure that we're talking apples to apples.
So when you say total number of 911 calls, that's not the total number of calls that come into the station. It's just those that come into the station and your career or volunteer fire staff.
Yeah, so I don't know that I ever would have said total number of 911 calls, because that's not something that sounds like a stat I would give you. Are you referring to the 4,866 alarms?
For 2023, it's 4866, yes.
Right, so that would
is
be-
in green.
That
So
would
the
be,
green numbers are what you gave me.
right, that would be fire incident responses only. No Nelson numbers are in there.
What comes into 911 goes through dispatch, which is a different thing.
Right.
Because
I-
911 calls would also include calls to the police department, but we're not going to be looking at those.
No.
That's-
This is just the numbers that he has provided, which I assume are calls for the fire department. So when you give your presentation,
They
the
always
very
are.
first thing that you present
Right,
is the total number of calls, which in 2022 was 5184, and in 2023 was 4866.
Right, and so if
presented
you-
those numbers.
so those are correct, 5184 for fire,
Yep.
4086 for fire.
Yep.
In 2022, 1100 for Nelson,
Yep,
1240 for Nelson, so Nelson absorbed more calls in 2023, which
Yes.
makes up a significant portion of that difference, right? 140 incidents roughly, so 4866 plus 140 brings us to what, just about 5,000, or just over 5,000? It's not a very big difference in call volume, and that was my point, and I almost positive I can pull it up, but in 2022, I referenced that we responded to more incidents than we ever had before. In 2023, I pulled that statement back because we've gone to less in 2023 and 2022. But at the end of the day, you're still talking 5,000 incidents, whether it's 100 plus, 100 minus, doesn't matter. We're running out of responses. We're running out of resources to send. We're talking about a difference of 100 calls right now.
well, but again, from the way that you had presented it, it sounded like total number of calls that come in for 911. That to me
Yeah.
sounds like that's the number you start with, and then a portion of that will go to Nelson, and the rest of it will be handled by.
No, and then this I'm clear on, that's how we presented it, is because we had a little debate back and forth on whether it, excluding the Nelson calls in terms of paramedic calls or things that are more health related, that you wouldn't include the Nelson calls in the percentages because it's not pulling from fire department resources.
Oh, yeah. No,
But
that I
so
agree.
that was the whole idea of not including those. If those calls were included in the total alarms, then that I wouldn't have suggested that percentage was not was irrelevant. I think that was sort of the debate that we had going back and forth.
So the point that I had tried to explain to Chairman Nazzolillo is I think it is very important that you get a clear picture of the demand from our community for emergency services from the combination of our fire department and from Nelson Ambulance. And to the extent that you can take that bigger number and break it down into medical, fire, and motor vehicle, that gives you a picture of what our community needs. And then when you carve out Nelson, then what is left is the demand on the fire department. And I think it's important, I'm sure Jenny, you appreciate this from its applications in public health and an understanding of demands in public health. You have to have the big picture first, and then you look at the individual departmental demand. And taking into consideration the role of Nelson Ambulance. And so that's why I did this down below. I showed the total number of calls. This is just for 2023. And I showed that there's a disproportionate weight towards medical calls. Again, this is assuming that the numbers that we were given were the total number of calls. And the breakdown that I assumed you gave me, Chief, was on the right-hand side. And that's without Nelson with Nelson is on the right-hand side, without Nelson is on the left. And that's, the 52%. And those are the numbers that you gave me. 52% EMS, 42% fire-related, and 6% MVA. And so I think it's important to be able to see the disparities between what the town needs and what the fire department, separate from Nelson, is providing.
So here's the thing.
Yes.
If the town needs a certain number of responses to medical calls, and that need is being partially met through Nelson,
Mhm.
the job of the fire commission and the chief is to create a budget that responds to what's not already, what the needs are for the fire department to respond to. There already has been a plan in place to create the responses to the medical calls without adding to the needs of the fire department to respond only to medical calls, which then limits the number of calls that that you can respond to. So, in terms of staffing wise, so I think that is why the budget that he presented looked at what the fire department is coming to the Board of Finance to ask for what the fire department needs to fund. And that does not include Nelson because of the fact of the way that the contract has changed, and Nelson is meeting a certain percentage of the medical calls.
Yeah.
So we wouldn't include that in the numbers because that is not necessarily what the funding demands are. So I think that's really where the disconnect is. Yes, you have to look at what your community needs as a whole, and that one of the responses was using Nelson to be able to decrease the demand on the fire department for medical calls. So that from that perspective,
But I very specifically asked the chief, the breakdown percentages of 52% medical call, that excludes
absolutely,
Nelson ambulance,
yes,
right?
yes.
So that's why I think you need to fold Nelson back in to see the bigger picture of demand from for our community, the overall demand for emergency response, which is 64%.
But what does that
So it's important in terms of how you allocate resources, whether they be limited resources or not limited resources, in order to meet the needs of our community.
Right, which is
One of
what-
the things is to utilize Nelson. Great,
Right.
absolutely, but that still leaves more than half the calls are medical in nature. The volunteers cannot respond to medical calls, right? So, and they very rarely, according to the chief, very rarely respond to motor vehicle accidents unless they're on the highway and they need an additional big vehicle in order to block traffic. So that really is a large fraction of the total number of calls are actually have nothing to do with the volunteers because they're not assigned to those particular calls. So I think having an understanding of our community's need for medical calls and for motor vehicle accidents that are not highway related, I think is important. And ultimately, Mr. Frieda has allocated money for a brand new ambulance, which would be your third ambulance, but you can only activate one, right? Because those are the choices that are made. That's not to say that you can't respond to a medical call using an engine or using a ladder truck, but you will have 3 ambulances at your disposal now, but you can't actually activate
Well,
them.
that's a problem with the fact that the Board of Finance hasn't actually allocated more
Well,
staff.
But again,
So,
the chief also said if he got the 4 firefighters that he had requested, he said during the workshop, he would assign 1 to each shift. 1
right,
to
and
each shift. And what would that do?
so I think the thing is
That
that,
wouldn't produce any additional service to our town. It might reduce contractual replacement staffing, but it would not activate another piece of apparatus. Right?
Because it's the first year. We're so far behind now in staffing, we need to continue to catch up. So if you think about my initial request of 16 a number of years ago has yet to be fulfilled. So we still need to move forward in that direction of hiring. So I'm glad that you're here though, Nancy, because
Yes.
it seems like you want to keep going back to the majority of the calls the fire department does is medical. When you're seeing in fact that's not the case, you just want to try to make the numbers appear that way. I wouldn't go to the Board of Finance and report on what the police department is responding to, and we respond with the police.
I
when
went
they
to the
take
police
calls off.
commission meeting, just so you know.
But we take calls off the police department's response as well, and vice versa. We don't talk about what the police goes to, so I'm not gonna talk about what Nelson goes to. My focus is on what the resources are of the fire department that are available at any given time, and what the incidents are that we're responding to. I provided that data during the workshop. But, one of the things that you said the other night, and this is why I'm glad you're here, is you said this as you were departing the town meeting was, there were comments made in our local press that basically implied that there would be reduced services, but that is not true. We have not ever been out of compliance, and the data does not support adding more firefighters. I don't understand how you can say that. I'm the fire chief.
Mm-hmm.
I have decades of experience,
Yes.
incredible amount of education to be able to report that we are falling short of the standards. I'm curious how you feel otherwise.
So, has the town of North Haven ever been notified by any state or federal authorities that you were out of compliance or even in jeopardy of being out of compliance with your staffing?
There's no agency that does that.
Not at the state or federal level.
Not for staffing, no. There's no agency that does that.
So how do you determine your staffing requirements?
Most departments listen to their chief and go off national standards. The
So-
national standard is NFPA 1710. That is a national standard.
So the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA, is a private organization that has zero enforcement authority.
Then why is it cited in court?
So, and you applied for a SAFER grant, and according to FEMA, apparently North Haven Fire Department doesn't need additional staffing because you didn't get a grant. And the goal of the SAFER grant is to enhance local fire departments' abilities to comply with staffing, response, and operational standards. So,
Right, so what
They-
standards?
so,
If
so
it's the intent is to comply, then what standards do you think it's referring to?
So even if they are NFPA standards, FEMA determined that you didn't need this
No,
money,
it's a
you
com-
don't need these additional
It's a
firefighters.
competitive grant process. There could have been other towns that are worse, so I wouldn't
I'm certain
necessarily
of
assume
that,
that.
I am
But
certain of
I
that.
take, I have to tell you, I heard that comment, which is why I had it transcribed. And I really find it hard to believe that as either as yourself or as a member of the Board of Finance, that you would say something contrary to what I'm saying in terms of this not meeting standards. If you choose to think that those standards don't matter, that's one thing. But don't mislead the public and say that we're okay with standards, because we're not. We're not in compliance with standards. I got something
What
else
will
to say.
happen if you're not in compliance with NFPA standards?
That's a
You tell
great
me.
question for the Board of Finance to consider.
It's a great question for the fire chief. What will happen
I'm-
if you are not in compliance with NFPA?
I'm seriously concerned about any kind of liability, from a workers' comp standpoint or from a civilian standpoint.
And I asked you during your workshop,
Mm-hmm.
you tell me which communities of our size, 24,000 people,
Mhm.
can actually deploy 14 to 17 firefighters to a structure fire, and you pointed to which town?
I gave you an example of Manchester,
Manchester, which has a
Right.
population of 60,000 people,
right?
has a local giant mall,
Mhm.
and 3 major highways.
Sure,
So it is nothing like the town of North Haven.
sure. So it's interesting that we're gonna now compare the number of citizens, right? That's the benchmark we're gonna use for comparison.
Usually it is,
It
yes.
is. How do you say usually? Usually compared to who?
Because
Who
the
said that?
same number of people that come into this town to work here
Mm.
leave this town every single day to work elsewhere.
Is that right? I haven't seen
Yes.
that anywhere. I'd like to see where it says that.
Okay. I mean, just look around this room, how many people work in this town? Right? One.
I do.
So,
Well,
I don't.
unfortunately,
I don't.
I don't think that you're correct, and I also think that it's unfortunate that you feel that way. The towns around us, the fires burn the same, right? Whether your town is 5,000 or your town is 500,000, the fires burn the same. The same number of people are needed on scene, and for a long period of time, this town was able to provide that number of firefighters on scene through a combination of career and volunteer. My point is, we're no longer able to do that. And so there is an acceptable level of risk that the community needs to be willing to accept if we're going to begin to move forward. And we need to have that honest conversation about what our limitations are. So no matter how big the population is, the call volume is the call volume. Or you're trying to dispute the call volume, I don't know what you started with, but that's not the case. The call volume is the call volume.
yes,
We only have so many apparatus to respond to so many incidents.
I agree, and I did an analysis based upon the numbers that you provided me, so, but again, Chief, back 2 years ago in, the January 2023, Fire Department workshop, I asked you 2 questions. Since it was right on the heels of the closing of this, historic Monmouth Fire Department program, I asked if you had any plans to do anything anywhere else. And do you have plans to expand the number of firefighters per shift beyond 11? And you said no. Well, at the same time, you were also applying for the SAFER grant. Well, that's kind of disingenuous, right? And you're
No.
also,
Because I think one is in terms of budgeting, and the other is in terms of long-term planning. Something that I continue to be an advocate of is long-term planning. But is that the same
well, you
medium?
have to disclose that. not only to this board, which you
Sure,
didn't,
we did
but
disclose
also
it, we did disclose we were applying for a grant, this board moved on it the entire time,
some
which
of
is
the board
why,
members on this board did not know you were applying for a safer grant.
which is why the number of staff was pulled out.
Again,
Was that the same meeting though, that you also said that we can't afford the fire department that we have now?
well, apparently we're over budget, right?
But so that you wanna cut the fire department, cause,
I'm not interested in cutting anything,
cause you
I'm
only
not
got October
interested in
20,
cutting
2021, which is
but I
fine
do
around.
want data that actually shows
No,
that there is an actual need,
sure.
rather than scare tactics that you're using in the local press.
Oh, that's not true, that's not scare tactic.
That is
Can I
absolutely
can I
what it
just,
is.
I just wanna, before we get into this back and forth, I think there are a couple things that are important to note. I think we have gotten a lot of data, that shows there is a need. I think there is no question about that. I think that every resident has a level of comfort on whether they want their fire department staffed in a certain way. There are towns across Connecticut that are 100% volunteer.
Yes.
I would not live in one of those towns. That to me is an unacceptable level of risk. And at this point in time, I live up on the northeast end of town. There
Yes.
are 5 volunteers. I see 4 and 5, 4 level housing units with cars parked underneath. That makes me very concerned. So I think that everyone can go around and say whether they feel safe or not, and people are going to come up with different conclusions. And I think part of the job of the commission is, and to the chief, is to be honest with the residents. Here's what we are afraid of, and that is based on the data, and it's based on talking about the struggles of the fire department on a monthly basis. And I don't know that there is, people aren't going to come up to the same conclusions. I don't think you can say there hasn't been data. There's been plenty of data over the last couple of years, or probably longer. I think the chief did a really good job of showing the decline of volunteers and how that impacts the number of apparatus that can get out, and the number of firefighters on scene at any given time. So, I just think that we just need to be clear that it's not a scare tactic. It's being honest with people. And I will tell you, I lived in ignorance for a long time. I had no idea that there were 4 firehouses and only one of them had personnel in them, prior to what was before that I wanted to run for the commission. But I did not realize that, because I saw what you saw. I drove by Northeast and I saw cars outside. I assumed people were in them.
Excuse me, I was on the Board of Finance and asked that question, and people seemed shocked that I didn't know the firehouses weren't staffed. So it started with me when I asked the question at the Board of Finance. And it was, I always assumed people were there because when I walked my dog by Ridge Road Station, I saw a lot of people there. And it didn't occur to me that they were not fully staffed.
Right.
So this
I
isn't
think
about-
we're very fortunate,
Yeah.
very fortunate to have both career firefighters and volunteers in our town. I agree with you, most fire departments are actually career. Most, in our country, that is, are actually.
Career.
Not career, sorry, are volunteer. Most are volunteer. So we are very fortunate to have both.
Is that accurate?
Yes, it is
Across the state of
absolutely true.
Connecticut?
It is
Yeah, I wouldn't
absolutely
live in a
true.
town that had both.
Again,
Across the country.
we are very, very
I can't-
fortunate, and they have not seen a mass exodus in volunteer firehouses all over Connecticut. That's, there are still some that exist and they're exclusively volunteer. But we are very fortunate to have both. But as I said, we have not seen the fruits of Mr. Frieda's economic development in terms of our grand list number. When we do see the fruits of all of his hard work and all of the people that work with him in terms of growing that grand list number, then I believe that we will have the funds in order to make other changes. Currently, we do not.
I don't believe that's true. I think the town makes choices about where their money's gonna go. And I can if you gave me the red pen, there would be a lot of places I would go and it wouldn't start with the fire
I
department.
can
So
assure you,
again,
I
I
stayed up
think
until
that's
4
a
o'clock in the
choice.
morning, and I came up with $3.3 million in reductions to the proposed budget. And Mr. Frieda rejected all of them except $270,000, and ultimately, even that $270,000 was wiped out because they actually used the wrong grand list number. And once they used the correct grand list number, it was all a wash.
Look, I appreciate your comments. I think we're going round and round here at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It appears to me that you feel that the department has sufficient monies and personnel to run the operation as we are now, considering that in your estimation that Nelson Ambulance has taken over 11% of the calls, so that's your opinion. I appreciate your opinion as a resident of the town.
Thank you.
I don't agree with that as a resident of the town, and I think my colleagues
That's what I was
don't.
trying to say, yeah.
But I appreciate you bringing this to our attention and for the work that you did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would love it, Chief, if you would share more data with the Board of Finance. I think everyone would greatly appreciate it, and we would really dig into it, and so that perhaps we could see what you can see. Because you look at these numbers every day and we don't. So I would love to be able to see some sort of trends or some sort of an objective, quantitative analysis that shows us what you're able to see and we cannot.
Sure, remember, you're welcome to stop by the firehouse and meet with me whenever you like. I don't think that we've ever met, and I think you've been in the firehouse once since you've been on the Board of Finance?
I participated in the fire ops.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. So
Mhm.
again, anytime you want to get maybe a different perspective, please let me know.
Right, but again, it's not so much a tour as much as I'd love to be able to see the databases and be able to see the
Sure.
type of data that you feel actually points in a different direction.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't think the chief is trying to scare the people of the town of North Haven. I mean, I think they have to be realistic. The big thing is the volunteers. These volunteers can't get out. I had volunteers that worked for me, and I would let them go. Now they have other jobs. They can't get out of their jobs.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many times that they can't respond to fires,
I understand.
and there's just not enough of them anymore, and nobody wants to be one anymore.
But that's why I started off asking the question, how many structure fires are there per year? And that's not to say that, one is too little and, 30 is too many. If you have your house on fire, it's a really significant event, and obviously you want enough people there to be able to knock it down. At the fire ops, actually one of your lieutenants presented a series of pictures in which his one engine was able to do a fantastic job knocking down a roof fire in a home, just them, so that by the time everybody else showed up, they had it really well contained. So it seems to me that the time to response is a really important statistic. And so that's why I asked that question as well. That I think time to response, first truck on scene is extremely important, as well as the total numbers.
Very good. Thank you very much.
you.
Appreciate it.
Sure.
Seeing that there's no one else here for public comment, I'll entertain a motion to move into executive session. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor? So moved. I'd like to reconvene the Tuesday, April 16, 2024 North Haven Fire Commission meeting to order. I'll ask for a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So moved.
Do I hear a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
This meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is brought to you in part through a grant from the town of North Haven. Watch town meetings or other videos on demand at nhtv.com.